your last name, right?
Bhattacharya.
Bhattacharya.
It's actually Bhattacharya, but I always just say Bhattacharya. Because the Y's are confusing.
Bhattacharya.
So, you are guests, and I have been here for 17 years. It took us 17 years to be a little bit visible, right? Now that we are visible, we are noticeable, good and bad. So, whatever you do on this campus doesn't affect me that much, but affect your students on campus, who have helped us organize so well. And Dr. Christine Hong, who has just started her career here. So she had put her neck into this venture. As you have noticed, this is not the friendliest place for Asian Americans or Asians, right? And women especially. So whatever you do affects people who will stay here. So first of all, if you have any problems, any requests, you need to go through me. Okay? Don't please talk to staff directly, and especially contract workers. There has been such attention between low-paid wage workers, such as kitchen staff and cleaning staff, and marginalized international students, and the majority body, right? So you need to be sensitive about that, please. Okay. So when you leave, you need to clean up. We don't want to be known as, uppity, messy Asians. Okay? When you leave your room, please make sure to leave your key at a visible place, so the staff who will be cleaning can easily spot your keys. They are, again, low-paid wage workers, okay? And Miguel Chavez, who has been here as long as I have been, he had been the sole Mexican man who runs the facilities. So, he'll get the blame if we leave everything messy, or if we talk to his staff rudely. That may not be what we are intending to do, but perception is important. Okay? So these are my complaints. Okay, but it's been wonderful. So Any questions? Any reactions? Okay. And so today we will start with the panel and the worship. And so if you have any questions about anything, any procedure, please ask me. And I'll get over it. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Morning. Are you here? Some of us did really wild dancing, some dancing last night. If you missed it, you really missed it. As Haruko said, this is our last, not only last day of conference, but this is our last official programming of this year's theme, Journey Toward Justice. So I am very honored and excited to wrap up our 2.5 days of Journey Toward Justice at this place, so-called the Deep South, with locally situated justice workers. They're locally situated, but they're nationally known. So I am just so grateful for the fact that this is Saturday, early in the morning, kind of, right, in the weekend, and we promised nothing except for our attention and our open heart to listen and share our experiences. No special bragging or gifts, but we asked them, and they graciously accepted our invitation. So thank you for being here, and thank you for being here, all of us. Now, their bios are printed in this hot pink, I guess, sheet of paper, because their bios are actually very long. If you want to start with the credentials or the organizational affiliations, it could be very long. But I kind of condensed into maybe one paragraph each or so. So today you'll have some opportunities and maybe even questions about their whereabouts, not only today, but how and where they have been. So what I am going to do as a moderator is that I'm going to actually ask Aparna to speak first, and then follow up by and Helen. But the way in which we want to do that is to contextualize all of us in down south. I understand that we have more than 20 people who officially register for this conference are coming from either Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina. As far as I could tell, I don't think that anybody is coming from Alabama yet. Anyone? But we have good 20 people. And I'd like to pause. This is our 34th year of annual conference together. So I'd like to pause and maybe reminisce a little bit about my involvement with PANAAWTM as well. For a long time, I was the only Southerner. So when we went around introducing ourselves, and I said, hi, my name is so-and-so, I'm coming from down south, or American South, or state of Georgia, or Atlanta. The variation of naming places was maybe different from time to time, but I was very self-conscious of being alone. Then some time ago, I used to say, hi, my name is so-and-so, and I'm with Nami Kim. Two of us are coming from Atlanta. Now we have more than 20 strong sisters in state of Georgia alone. And so I am very proud, I guess. And also it's personally meaningful to talk about social justice act and activities and struggles that we actually all engage in, day out, in the context of the South. So what I would like for us to be aware of is that this is a panel, yes, but the way in which we actually designed or thought about how to go about doing this panel is that we are going to try our best to situate ourselves in a concrete context, both geographic, historical, and especially the space, whether it's a social space or physical space. Then perhaps we're going to move on from there. This is the location that we're actually moving from, and then lift up our experiences of working in various causes and various communities. And perhaps our stories will be actually reflecting not only where we are geographically, but where we have been as individually, but as a community. We are women, we are Asian Americans, Asian American Pacific. Literally, this year, we have Asian, Pacific Islanders, Asian North Americans, not only US, but Canadians as well. So we'll be integrating some of our identity politics as well as how we embody who we are as workers of justice-seeking, justice-making people. So those are some of the categories that we have been actually consciously thinking about and reflecting in order for us to actually share our stories. So that's where we are going to go and come back and move forward and backwards. Okay? Now, in terms of understanding Asian American communities here in the South, those of us who are still not, maybe have not heard much about exciting work that people are doing in American South, we will hear ample stories and struggles today through panelists. There are a lot of demographic peculiarities that I think the whole nation, or maybe non-Southerners, are aware of. So I'm just gonna skip to here. Okay? Now, in terms of growth rate, population growth rate, Asian American in the nation ranked the highest in terms of growth rate in South, especially in the state of Georgia. Those of us who are coming from Gwinnett County, driving all the way from Duluth, maybe Suwannee, did you know that from 1990 to year 2000, it was the fastest growing Asian American community in the nation? So the visibility and perhaps invisibility in down south is really changing fast, very fast. Within the last 20 years or so, we have been invisible and then visualized, but in pockets of different cities and counties, we have different understanding about critical mass. City of Duluth, talking about in the South, comprises of 12% of Asian Americans. And so that's part of the South as well. I'd like to highlight a few of the bottom ones. I know that when we were doing social justice work, we ended up looking at some of the depressing statistics, poverty, racism, underemployment, unemployment, and so on and so forth. So we do have those, but I'd like to highlight something that maybe those of us who are not really looking at the numbers, specifically home ownership among Asian American and Pacific Islander Americans in the state of Georgia is quite peculiar. On the one hand, Vietnamese Americans and so-called the refugee and the subsequent generation refugees are still suffering economically as well. But with all that struggle, we put priorities in acquiring family homes. So for example, Vietnamese Americans and Korean Americans among Indian Americans, Indian Asian Americans, rank highest in terms of home ownership. So when we file paperwork for community needs assessment, for example, when we ask, do you own a home? As to check your socioeconomic status of some kind. That will get us the wrong, this is literally misinformation. So as an Asian Americans, I know that we have a diverse ethnicities and religions and so on and so forth, but even for how our own government uses some survey questions to determine which classes, which community needs are going to be addressed from time to time, especially for the budgetary perspective, it could get us into wrong direction as well. All this and more complexities that we are going to lift up. But I just want you to know that American South is not homogeneous, just like anywhere else. It is a complex and very rapidly changing and growing community. So I'm going to turn to 3 powerful community leaders who are going to highlight their own specific aspects of working in very different types of community. We have ordained ministers with us. We have advocacy workers with us, especially focusing on the victims of domestic violence. We have, how should I put it, human rights workers with us, community activist workers with us. I'm not just referring to our panel here, but all of us included. Okay? And I have also asked our panelists to speak no more than 8 minutes. With all this, no more than 8 minutes. And then perhaps I'm going to ask open-ended interview-like questions. Maybe, depending on the time, we'll go around maybe 2 rounds of interview questions. Then I'm going to open up. When I say open up, all of us as a justice-making workers, and I'm going to actually ask you to have conversation, not only here and there, but among ourselves. Okay? That's the plan. Would that work? Yes. Okay, good. Then I'm going to actually ask Aparna to start.
It's tough being the first one, huh? Y'all can hear me? Yes. All right, just making sure. My name is Aparna Bhattacharya. I'm the executive director of an organization called Raksha, which means protection in many South Asian languages. I have been with the organization 21 years as an employee and 24 altogether as a volunteer. The organization started out as a volunteer-run organization to address issues that the South Asian community was facing, and at that time, we had no organizations meeting our needs. And it was modeled on organizations in the Northeast like Sakhi for South Asian women, and Manavi, which was the first South Asian organization working on gender-based issues. We were all volunteers. We would check a voicemail. We didn't have as many cell phones then, and we didn't have Google Voice, so we would check a voicemail 3 to 5 times a day, and we all kind of were just doing the work from our homes. We didn't have an office. And the organization started basically because there were some young South Asian women who were from Augusta who remembered a domestic violence situation when they were growing up, and when they saw Manavi and Sakhi, they were like, wow, it would have been really great if we had something like this in the South. And so an attorney took a break from her work as a tax lawyer and came down here and started Raksha. And I was handed the flyer by my father, who thought, wow, the time I was doing work around victim advocacy in the city of Atlanta, working with victims of crime, and he said, this might be really interesting to you. And I was like, wow, okay, let me check it out. Maybe I can bring the skills working in the courts to really help my community. Yeah, my path changed after that. If you had told me as a child that I'd be working for a South Asian-based organization, I would have never imagined. Because growing up, I tried to avoid my community as much as I could. I was like, oh, the politics, oh, the gossip, oh, you know, all the things of like, you can't do, you know, I just had all my views of community. And my journey working through Raksha has helped me learn to love my community and accept my community and feel more comfortable in my community. Was it always easy? No. I mean, definitely when you're dealing with issues around domestic and sexual violence, the community's not comfortable talking about that. And we definitely heard a lot of things, oh, you girls and your little project, you know? Right, 24 years later, we're still here. and we're the ones that you come to when you're dealing with a difficult situation and don't know how to help somebody in the community. But it was hard in the beginning. Definitely, people didn't want to talk about it. There was a lot of like, oh, well, we don't really want to give you space in our office because what if something happens and won't look good? But slowly but surely, we had to keep reminding people that there was a reason why we needed to be there. And of course, it was the survivors that we worked with, it was the calls that we got, and the work that we were doing that we knew we needed to be there. The founder had left, had moved to moved to DC, and a few of us were left and we're like, no, we need to do this work. We got to keep doing it. We'll find a way to do it. And at the time, we were only doing it as volunteers. So we got our first funding, we had a part-time employee, and then luckily we got one anonymous donation that helped me come on as a full-time staff person to do this work. We have grown. We got our first office. It was like a very small space with a telephone. And then we've grown to expand our services to providing counseling for children and adults. We do a lot of engagement with the community by having outreach booths, doing presentations. We do advocacy, so, supporting individuals and going to court with them, helping them explain what their legal rights are, helping connect them to attorneys. And we do a lot of training of systems so that they know, number one, that they need to provide language access to our community, so that they know about the immigration relief for survivors who may not have documentation or might be in a precarious situation with their immigration documentation. We also train them on cultural competency. I was just in Columbus. I saw a car from Muskogee, so I don't know if there's anybody from the Columbus area, but I was just in Columbus yesterday training advocates on working with our community, and they feel stumped in working with the South Asians that are in that area. They're like, we don't know. We know that they're here, but they're hesitant to utilize our systems. So even prepping them of like, you need to build a relationship before the crime occurs. You have to build trust with them before the crime occurs. But at least it was beautiful to see that they were willing and open to learn about how they could better serve our community. This work has not always been easy. Like I said, community is sometimes tough. Sometimes you're dealing with systems that don't want to acknowledge it. Some of the systems and some of our funders don't want to openly talk about the fact they'll serve undocumented individuals. They don't want too much attention on the bilingual stuff. And it's a hard journey. But, it's taken 20 years to see a lot of change, but sometimes I also feel like we're also going backwards at times. So the things that we were fighting for that we thought was basic, like when you call a shelter, they're supposed to get an interpreter. Why should we have to call multiple times and get an advocate involved to be able to get an interpreter for someone who might speak Bangla? Right, and those are the battles that we continue to fight, and it gets annoying. But at least, by staying in it, that I feel like at least you can have funders learn, and then you can try and bring in resources, and that's an important part of our work. Our work is never ending. We need to realize that. We think we'll be done, and it's constant because there's a constant shift in what's happening, and that's part of what I learned. And part of my journey now is just trying to figure out how do we continue to, number one, get individuals to acknowledge the problems that are in our community and talk about it and feel comfortable talking about it. How do we get our community leaders to be comfortable talking about this? And then how do we get our systems to change and be accessible for all of us? I'm guessing it's about 7 to 8 minutes.
Perfect.
Oh. Okay. Well,
All right. Hi. I am recovering from an egg hunt yesterday. So I wanted to share a little bit about my work with Korean American children as a children's pastor in a Korean immigrant church in the PCUSA. So my church, my former church, was here in Atlanta. It still is. In the middle of my doctoral studies, I just wanted to explain how I got into children's ministry. I have a penchant for being childlike and playful, and I'm also very dramatic. So children's ministry suits me well. But I kind of didn't want to go into it because I know how children's ministry can be a position of marginality for women pastors. So I wasn't going into children's ministry for a while. I was in my doctoral studies. But I visited my old church in New Jersey where I had served as a children's pastor for 4 years, like 10 years ago. And I got to meet some of my former students. And I was amazed by how they had grown and become so cool and successful and earning a lot more money than I was earning. And then I was so also shocked by how faith played such a central role in their lives. And they shared memories about our times in Sunday school and youth group that were meaningful to them, and even remembered some of my sermon illustrations. So that really stroked my ego a lot. And that experience also sort of reframed how I felt about working with youth and children. So yes, there's no doubt that sexism and patriarchy often sidelines women pastors into the work of glorified babysitting in churches. But I also I decided to use the church's marginalization of women pastors into a weapon against injustice. And I could use my own privilege as an ordained pastor to resist being sidelined and to create my own boundaries, an agenda of spiritual formation for children, of which justice was a central theme. So I just want to recognize that, you know, my position and my privilege and how that shaped my choice to go into children's ministry and my work to try to help our children grow up to be people who are engaged in the work of justice and coalition making. Well, when I started, this was in the middle of my doctoral studies, and I couldn't find an existing Asian American curriculum for spiritual formation. So I just had to try stuff out. And even if I didn't know everything, I was like, oh, I feel like I need to do more research and more research. But times were urgent. Black Lives Matter, Standing Rock, Muslim ban, separation of migrant families, school shootings, and climate change. I just couldn't wait. So I went for it, and I began small by using our worship liturgy as a guide for helping children interpret policies, leadership choices, and current events through theological perspectives. So in our joys and concerns time, I would put pictures of what was happening in Standing Rock and explain colonial history upon which this nation was founded, and wonder with the children about how Christians might respond to the choice of using God's creation to pollute water, steal land from people, and profit big oil companies. And of course, they're like, no, we want to take care of our planet. So that's what I did. I incorporated current events in every week's prayer of confession. And so that's how I sort of educated them upon current events and what was going on as much as I could. And age developmental appropriate stuff. I didn't put like bleeding pictures or anything. So the children, I learned to lament together, looking at pictures of what was going on beyond their comfortable suburbs, and brainstorming what God's love might look like through us. So to move away from a depoliticized, privatized spirituality, I would ask, what do you think Christians should do when these kinds of injustices happen in our world? Should we pray and worship in our churches only? And there's, you know, it's just like a no-brainer for them. They're like, no? So, like, animated. should we be out there in the world and do something? Yeah. And so this is the product of some of their reflections. This is a poster for a lemonade stand that we made to sell lemonade to raise money for migrant families. So that was the backdrop of our lemonade stands. We earned, I think it was quite a lot of money. It was like, I don't know, maybe 3,000 or something like that. So, I mean, people paid for those lemonades. The other thing that, so this is another child's artwork. I just thought it was beautiful. And then this is a third grader's prayer, okay? So this is after some lessons on Japanese internment camps and concentration camps and slavery. And so this is what she wrote. I was a stranger and you welcomed me, so that's from Matthew. Families are separate, this is a prayer. Families are separated at borders. The hope of children finding their parents are lost. Children are sent to court to represent themselves. They are locked away in cages, sent to camps to live on their own. Lord, history repeats itself. Help us to welcome those in, not to lock them in cages as if they were nothing before. Who are we to call ourselves servants of you, God, when we constantly sin worse than before? As Chinese people and Japanese people were put in intermediate camps and Jews sent to concentration camps. Concentration camps before. Okay. It's as now when we separate families and put them camps filled with sorrow and no warmth of love. Heavenly Lord, help the families who have been separated. Bring love back to the lost families. So this is a third grader, she's forming this prayer. So I just thought, I was just shocked and touched by how, even if we may not feel like we know everything, just to start and let that small knowledge lead us to bigger knowledge. And I was just so touched by how these weekly liturgy and weekly worship practices can make such a difference in the way that children view the world. How much time? 2 minutes? I think 2 minutes are too little to do other stuff. So I'm just going to show a little bit about what I do. So I talked about the parable of the Good Samaritan, to talk about how they might feel invisible in their lives. I also chose it to talk about how black and brown bodies are just left over on the side of the road and passed over like they're nothing. So kind of looking at current events, looking at how our different groups view each other and how we are rendered invisible and how we also profit off of black and brown communities. So talking about this all through the lens of the scripture story and also a storybook like this, which is about, this invisible boy is about a boy who feels invisible at school. And he eats alone at lunch. And I chose this story because the kids also drew stories about themselves eating alone at lunch. So I just wanted to let them know, that's not just your story, it happens, and it's a normal, it's not normal, but it's not just your story. And then one day, so he's eating alone by himself, but he likes to draw, so just, even if you're invisible, you have certain gifts. There's one day, a Korean American boy comes to class named Justin, and he brings bulgogi. It's a Korean barbecue, right? And then these kids are like, what is what? Bulgogi? And they're all making fun of him, and all the kids are like, oh, that's happened to me. So they're all silent. They're just mesmerized by that story because they've never really read themselves represented in these books. So it's a story of friendship in which the invisible boy tells him, I liked your food, and so then they formed this friendship. And it shows one of the boys, Emilio. He says, like, I think there's a project where they're supposed to pair up, and then he's like, oh, I'm already with Justin, says Emilio, find someone else. But then this Korean American boy says, so he wants to just get swallowed up in that hole at that moment. But then this boy says, well, Mrs. Carlotti said we can have up to 3 people in our group. We're only 2. Come on, Emilio. Let him work with us. So justice, solidarity, and coalition making, that these kind of stories, I just wanted to let the children know that you can be an agent, and you can also reach out to people who feel invisible, just as you know, you might also be made fun of, but we can all be in this together. So I will end at that.
Good morning. I realize I'm the last official speaker between you and leaving, so thank you for paying attention for just a little bit more. While I pull up my my PowerPoint, I guess I can say I wasn't going to focus much this time on kind of a lot of the stuff that brought me here. First of all, I want to thank all the PANAAWTM organizers, especially Dr. Kim, for just giving me this honor to share with you guys today. Anything Dr. Kim asked me to do, I always say yes. Also, I mean, just quick background, I've been an attorney for, it'll be 20 years this year. Can't believe how old I am. I'm a civil rights attorney. My specialty is workplace discrimination law. That includes, obviously, sexual harassment. 12 of my 20 years I dedicated to the full-time nonprofit space, and that switch is yet another story, but it was a decision built on a lot of prayer and discernment. So for me, I have a brother who's a pastor. For me, I felt called by God to use the skills that I have in public service, and I ultimately founded what is now known as Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta. When I founded it, it was the first Asian American civil rights organization in the Southeast. There's nothing before it, and you know, it continues on to this day, obviously. If you guys ever want to hear how hard that was, bring a tissue, give me your shoulder, and I'll tell you all about how difficult it is to build something like that from scratch. But I wanted, you know, I know Dr. Kim wanted me to speak about my civic engagement work, so I wanted to begin with a definition. Civic engagement or civic participation is any individual or group activity addressing issues of public concern. Citizens acting alone or together to protect public values or make a change or difference in the community are common types of civic engagement. So, you know, I wanted to highlight the word public because civic engagement, it takes public action or taking a public stand that's bigger than just about you, your family, your job, your money. You know what I mean? It's actually a very vulnerable process because you're taking a stand. You're stepping up for something. I know there are a lot of activists in this house, especially my girlfriends here at Columbia Seminary and Candler. You guys are the bomb. But I just want you to think about that. And I just want to pose these questions as I speak, you know, to everyone to think about. What's the intersection of your faith and civic engagement? What do you believe your faith demands of you to do? Okay. Also, what's the intersection of your identity as a woman or notions of femininity and your level of public or civic engagement? You know, what feels uncomfortable about that? Okay. And then obviously the intersection of all of our identities as women, as people of color, as immigrants, as people of faith. So anyway, let me just begin. I'm going to talk about my political work and then end, hopefully, with one of the most meaningful campaigns I ever got to work on, which was the Comfort Women campaign here in Atlanta. But okay, let me just start. Unless you were under a rock, we were all enthralled with midterm elections, right, here nationally. That's my friend Stacey Abrams. That's right. She was robbed. She really was robbed. But okay, anyway, Stacy is actually a friend. I was on her kitchen cabinet team from 2017, and I just helped in whatever little ways that I could, connecting her with Asian American voters and donors, contributing to her messaging. As everyone knows, Brian Kemp, this guy over here, he won by less than 18,000 votes through employing a variety of strategies I just summarize as voter suppression, okay? Lots of different ways that works, but that's the gist, right? So, you know, what's interesting is that when Brian Kemp, the year that he became Secretary of State in 2010 was the year I began my nonprofit. And a year later, Stacy, who I'd already known, became the House Minority Leader. And 2 years afterwards, in 2013, she started her first nonpartisan nonprofit. Now I'm like, which one is it? Anyway, she has two now. But to work on increasing the vote, similar to my organization. So I'm familiar with both. So anyway, we heard about it. Georgia seemed to be ground zero last year for voter suppression, right? So how did all of this happen? Did it start that day? It actually didn't. You know, we actually, through the work of my former nonprofit, you know, by 2012, I realized that civic participation, civic engagement in the form of protest, right, going, you know, and doing, you know, getting arrested, something like that, that was just not comfortable for the Asian American community leaders and groups that I worked with. And back then, okay, especially in Georgia, that was the only thing. Immigrants were not seen as political agents at all. We were non-politicized. Either we were undocumented or we were poor, and we were always foreign and other, okay? The only two large funded groups were social services, more direct services, great work. But from a position of advocacy or political engagement, there was nothing. And in the Latino community, there was one very small group doing it. But, you know, a lot of times for our community, we were like 15 years behind. So Latino and Asians, we were both kind of seen as non-politicized agents. The advocacy groups that I was aware of in the Latino community mostly organized around the rights of undocumented immigrants, which totally get it, right? But anyway, back to the Asian American community, one thing that I saw a lot of these volunteer-based cultural community organizations do were voter registration. So really, the whole base of the civic engagement program that continues to largely fund my nonprofit was based on this knowledge, you know, working and meeting our community where they were. They were okay with voter registration, so we said, all right, let's do it like to the moon. Let's coalesce together and maximize our impact and reach. So through a series of you know, focus groups, we came up with the message, vote for our future. Parents were always like, well, I don't vote, because that's not me, but my children are going to be president of the United States. It's like, well, how are they ever going to be president if they never saw you vote, if they never saw you get active in public life? Like, we as parents, I'm a mother now, we have to model the behavior we want our children to see. And if you don't do anything like that, then no, your children are not going to be the president of the United States. So anyway, that year, my group was the first. I don't know, you know, most Asian Americans are naturalized citizens, right? So I got this idea, and my one staff member at the time, no, it was maybe two by then, we struck a deal with a local USCIS to go whenever they had naturalization ceremonies, you know, where you get sworn in. Have you guys gone to any of those? They're really moving. So anytime there's a naturalization ceremony, we said, hey, look, we know that you always put a voter registration form in the thing of documents. Would you allow us to stand right outside that room and help anyone who wants, you know, to check their form and help them register? So they said yes, and we thought maybe it'd be like 5 times. There were like 2 or 3 ceremonies every week. Okay, maybe not that much, about 2 every week in different places, often at USCIS. So we went every time they called, and this is leading up to the 2012 presidential election. So it was, you know, who's done voter registration before? Anybody? So you know what it's like. I mean, you do a voter registration drive, people run away from you like you're asking for an organ, you know, like Nobody wants to talk with you. Totally opposite at naturalization ceremonies. These people had worked hard to become citizens. They were excited that they could actually have a say in who was elected president in 2012. So we would sometimes have a line of a couple hundred people patiently waiting to have us check their forms and submit it. So at the end of the day, I think that year we helped to register close to 1,500 folks. And then we started getting calls about a month and a half before the elections. USCIS would even call us, hey, we know you're the group that's been registering folks, and people are calling us saying they haven't gotten their registration card back, or they went to vote early and that got turned away, and can you please call them? After getting about half a dozen calls, I convinced my intern at the time, Peter, to go back and literally check every single physical form that we had to the Georgia Secretary of State's My Voter page. If you're a registered voter, you can be able to put your name and your birth date and see what your registration status is. Okay, by doing that, we found out that nearly 600, or 40% of those we had helped to register, were either not even showing up or challenged, okay? So from there, we began, this is what you do when you come upon problems like this. First, you try and work it out internally, okay? You put that nice Asian face on it. Hey, I'm your friend, come on. Talk to the Secretary of State's main contact. Hey, I have an Excel sheet. Here's every single name. Here's all their information. All of these people are naturalized citizens. Unless you think the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services are conducting fraud, these are real citizens. Help us help you. Here's everything. Real nice, very nice and engaging woman. Nothing happened. So 2 weeks before the election, we decided to make the letter we sent to her public. And it was the hottest thing locally, press-wise. They still didn't really do anything. We did a lot of other things, literally driving county to county with boxes of our registrants by county, going to actually county election officials, because that's how hard we were trying to help these new citizens actually vote. It was heartbreaking, honestly. In any case, what happened? Not much. And then after the election, we were slapped with an investigation by the Secretary of State questioning the legality of our voter registration practices. Now let me note, since Stacy has lost, and in the past 21 days since a new elections ethics board has been created and new Secretary of State, her group has now had 3 investigations filed against them. Wow. So this is a very common tactic. At that time, let me tell some more inside stories. At that time, when we identified all these voter registration irregularities, that's a nice way of putting it, there was a systematic dismissal of voters of color, new voters of color, because new voters are new citizens. New citizens are immigrants. Most of us are people of color. So there was a systematic dismissal. There were so many ways to fix that. The Secretary of State knew their only job is elections, but they refuse to do anything. That's often how voter suppression works. And then, to attack the people that are identifying the issue. Well, once we learned this, I started talking with funders and national litigation groups. This is what voter suppression looks like. This is what we need to work on. But at the time, they're only focused on voter ID and direct discrimination at the polls. It's, I'm sure you guys in the church world and faith world and academia, you have your own big battles, but there tends to be shiny ball syndrome. That was not the shiny ball. We were a tiny little group. We spent years talking about it, not to much avail. Sorry about that. Another small inside story, this incredible civic engagement work we did at USCIS ultimately got wrested away from us from a white women-led nonprofit and a white women-led foundation. I was told that we need to know our place. That's nonprofit politics. Again, give me a tissue, I'll tell you more. But you know what? Whatever. We still kick butt. Chung-Ha, you stole that slide from me, but that's okay. Following year, 2013, we created a candidate training 6 Asian Americans ran for office. That was one of the most visible shifts in like, hey, we are getting politicized. Hey, the work we're doing actually makes a difference. And then in 2018, 5 Asian Americans ran in Gwinnett County alone. That was the county that Chung Ha talked about. That's the most diverse county. Pretty amazing. I don't want to just credit my organization. I honestly need to give credit to Trump for winning in 2016. It literally woke people up. A lot of people on the sidelines, it really did. So sometimes good things happen out of bad. My church last year, I have a lot of church members here with us, Souls to the Polls. Koreans are one of the largest minority groups in Gwinnett County. Gwinnett County, for the first time last year, offered an early Sunday voting, another form of voter suppression by limiting early voting options. So Sunday was one of the days, we all know, my parents were small business owners, only day they didn't work was Sunday. So 12 churches, we were able to organize 12 churches led by our church, Korean Central, to help get information out, raise awareness on the importance of voting and the availability of Sunday voting. And, you know, it was a wonderful, wonderful way that I got to kind of mix my civic engagement skills with my faith as a Christian. Although, of course, you know, what's the inside scoop on that? I mean, there are hundreds of Korean churches, so just getting 12, you know, in the big scheme of things, we had trouble organizing with pastors. There was also a political split. It's not spoken about very openly, but what I came to realize is there were a lot of pastors here that are anti-LGBTQ and anti-abortion, and so that automatically makes them, you know, I'm over on this side. And, you know, I realize that there are political, you know, divisions among pastors. Then also this overall feeling in church, we do our religious stuff inside the 4 walls of the church. That's what Christianity is about. We don't step out into controversy ever. And I really appreciate Reverend Enby's talk earlier about how we shouldn't do that. I'm just going to finish one sentence with the Comfort Women Memorial. Are you guys familiar with the Comfort Women? A huge part of World War II history and really a human rights and international women's rights issue. We faced an incredible wall of ignorance in Atlanta. Again, I think that's part of living in an area where Asian Americans and immigrants as a whole are a new demographic. We ultimately got it up in Blackburn Park in the city of Brookhaven, thank God, despite the incredible fight put up against us by the Japanese Consul General, who was directed by Prime Minister Abe, who's a nationalist, if you didn't know, to focus on defeating any such attempts to memorialize these 200,000 women and girls who were sexually enslaved. You know, inside scoop, and I want to share this because we're all Asian women here. This project, I was hired to do this. It was funded and steered within the Korean community by all Korean men. It never dawned on them how odd that was. I even asked them, we need Korean women on this group. I forced them to make me pull together multicultural, multi-ethnic coalition that ultimately, you know, led the movement. But I remember the chair saying, I don't know any Korean women leaders. I don't know any. I got compliments during that time. These are compliments. That I work like a man. I'm a man. I'm aggressive. I'm a man. Because a woman can't act this way. You know, I mean, let's be honest, there's a lot of misogyny and gender issues, not only that men carry, but honestly that we carry, that I carry. I'm not going to lie. It's very uncomfortable. I am an introvert. But for a cause that's important or a community I believe in, I'll go toe-to-toe. I'll fight a government, right? But that isn't because I naturally feel great about conflict. I struggle a lot with the notion of power and that it feels gendered to me. And is it okay for me to be empowered? And as a Christian and as a Christian woman, is it okay as part of my service not to just do direct service, and there's nothing wrong with that, but what did Jesus teach us about speaking out about systemic issues? and really standing up publicly in a way. And what are the things that stop us? Because I've seen in church the disparate kind of divisions between men and women, even in service. So I don't know the answers to that, but I just really appreciate this time. I look forward to our discussion afterwards.
Originally, I was thinking about asking maybe, hopefully, 2 rounds of interview questions and so on and so forth. But I am going to ask maybe 1 or 2 questions. Not all of our panelists needs to actually answer. But the 2 questions that I would like to lift up is by perhaps making very simple observation. The justice-oriented work is not just large and systemic and theoretical that we cannot do anything about, but it's something that we could do every day. Every day. I hope you heard from 3 panelists' work and their sharing of journey toward justice, that you heard what they did every day, right? It's being conscious about the issue and being faithful to our call. They act every day, little by little. So given that context, and Helen just concluded with, I rushed her, I concluded with coalition building. So I'm gonna ask very, maybe simple, but maybe fun to kind of reflect back on. It's about perhaps identifying and sharing cases of the least expected partners in our coalition building. You know, sometimes, like Helen said, you know, with many different baggages, sometimes men, Korean American men, are forefront about advocating a particular women's issue. Sometimes, those of us who are 2nd and 3rd generation, hyphenated Asian Americans, are forefront about people with limited English proficiency. So how and what are some observations and reflection about the coalition building that you did, but perhaps really surprised you? Pleasant surprises in life as you work on justice.
When we talk about coalition building, I feel like that's the basis of our work in the very beginning. It's been a forefront of my work because, so we talked about being in the South. There weren't many South Asian organizations to work with, so you felt very alone and isolated. And for me, anytime I would see a South Asian leader doing gender-based, violence work, I'd be like, oh my goodness, someone I can talk to, a mentor. So actually, our coalition came from the other immigrant organizations that were doing domestic violence work. So when Raksha was starting, there were a few other organizations like Center for Pan-Asian, Community Services. There was Refugee Families, well, it was actually Newcomers Network, which is now New American Pathways. There's a few of us. Caminar Latino, which works with the Latino community. There's like 4 Jewish Family and Career Services. So we all were coming together to work on what became International Women's House. And in us working together, we figured that we had a unified voice working together as opposed to working alone, saying, hey, here's my community, and hey, here's my community. But we felt like all refugee and immigrant survivors needed to have a unified voice, and that we needed to work towards making sure our communities were seen, even though we all had different communities that we were working with. And that was really a strong path that, number one, supported us in our work on a daily basis. So I could go to India and make sure that the survivors I was working with, because I was one staff person at the time, right? So I could actually take the break I needed, and I had my Polish colleague who was working at Tapestry who would meet up and follow up with the survivors I was working with. that has been a value that I've held on consistently. And it kind of feeds into my work of like when I'm working with underserved communities, that I'm not just an advocate for the South Asian community, but all refugee and immigrants, LGBTQ, racial issues, thinking about all the diversity and all the underserved communities that we have to continue to be a voice, and how I integrate that into my work. So that's been one of the core values I've held in, like, number one, having unified voice to make sure, like, our systems, like we created an I Speak booklet that covers all the languages, so law enforcement officers, shelters, and other programs can at least identify the language and can't be like, well, I didn't know what they spoke, right? So that's been a big part of my work and how I've continued to integrate coalition work, but also even working with folks that normally, like law enforcement, how they can call us for help when they don't know what to do. Don't always agree with everything that they do, but also they also see us as a resource. And it's the same thing with the men in our community who, you know, end up supporting our work more vocally sometimes than even the women, because they may not feel comfortable or they fear how the men in their lives may deal with it. But that's been, yeah, that's how I can talk about the relationships and how we've done our work.
Aparna,
Yes.
could you tell us a little bit about Raksha, the name of the organization?
About the organization?
No,
like,
the Raksha, the
Raksha
meaning
means
of it.
protection. Any more?
I want to lift up perhaps not so often talked about in this kind of circle. That's the agency. I've been thinking about this in my own work as well as observation of other people's work as well, especially in terms of Asian American women doing community-based activism. Now, I know that there are a lot of books and perhaps articulation of what activism or the agency looks like, individual agency as a human looks like. But the more I get to reflect, the more I get to actually have a conversation and get to know other people's, I'm talking about women leaders in the community, I wonder whether we have different understanding and experience of agency. And so, for example, I just quoted here, doing what had to be done. If you remember, yesterday, Pulan talked about PANAAWTM book projects, the history of PANAAWTM book projects. Our second book project with Soo-Yeon Park and I edited, we wanted to lift up Asian American women leaders. And we came across when we actually asked them, do you see yourself as Asian American leaders? So I am Asian, I am a woman, I do these things. Leaders? I'm not a leader. And so, for example, Dora Kim, those of us who know, maybe don't know, she's a third generation Korean American woman who actually talked about and coalescing with all the nonprofit organizations in the Bay Area in LA. At her 60th birthday, a journalist goes there and obviously she's the leader. And so she asks the question, so what kind of leader are you? And she says, really? She kind of looked around and said, are you talking to me? And she said, all I did is doing what had to be done, right? And I hear that from all three of us, all three of you, who talked about it. You know, I was pulled into this. I was called into this. I was trying to be faithful to God's call. I was trying to do this. There's somebody else there. No one else took it, so I just took it on. It's that. It's different from being humbleness. And I kept on thinking about this for a long time. And so I wonder if we could share a little bit about how we see, who we see, why we see ourselves as people doing the work, yes, but not necessarily as women leaders. So I'm going to open it up to maybe share reflection about this. If you have been thinking about this for a while, maybe, you know, start with the panelists, but I'd like to hear from you. You know, we're leaders in the church because that's the title that we could actually put our head on from time to time. But what is it about us that we're so hesitant to claim to be a leader in a particular communal setting? Any thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, I spoke about it a little as I was ending, but, you know, I know the way I was raised. My mom was actually my mom and dad definitely pushed me to focus on my education. I have 2 older brothers. I didn't feel like I got too much, you know, kind of sexist training, although my dad would always say when I was little, you're not going to go to, what's marriage? 시골 is the country. What's the
결혼? 시집?
시집. You're not going to go to 시집 if you do that. 시집 is you're not going to get married. I didn't know what that was. I thought it meant heaven when I was a little kid. And then I realized my dad was just there. You're not going to get no man if you act that way. Well, so I mean, you know, okay. So take it back. Maybe I did learn some gendered things, but you know, I'll say, you know, not blaming my parents, just like our entire culture here in America and also in Korea. I know that for me, I generally feel a little distrustful and uncomfortable with power. It's scary to me. And then when people ascribe or identify me as having someone with power, I feel uncomfortable with that. And just like you say, Chung-ha, I feel uncomfortable owning my own power and even accepting that this idea of leadership. I feel I'm so not Korean, but if someone compliments me, I do, you know, then I get 1,000% Korean. So, you know, I'll say something else. So this came up in something that I volunteered with an amazing, incredibly brave group of students. But this notion of politeness, right? And how many of us as women are expected to be polite, okay, civil. And our code of civility is different from men's code of civility, right? And if you really think about that, that code of civility perpetuates an unequal dynamic. But how many of us carry that inside of us? I'll admit I do. Like I said, I will go to battle for the right causes and for the right communities. Doesn't mean I don't feel incredibly uncomfortable, that I don't feel hurt by the perceptions and the gossips and the whatever that happens. That's real stuff. I think that happens in a church context too. Seen it, right? So I don't know the answer, but I do think we're all products of our culture, right? So I just think as we continue to evolve and grow in our faith and our mission work, for me at least, a huge part of my work has been more inward and spiritual, really kind of parsing through why I feel certain things, why I feel uncomfortable, and hopefully kind of getting beyond those things, you know, accepting that I'm a boss, and that's okay. And being a boss means some people aren't gonna like me. Oh well, you know. It's taken a long time, but it's a struggle.
Very similar to Helen. Of course, I remember socialization as don't go near the fire, you might burn yourself, then you won't get a good husband. All those lovely things. Don't go out in the sun, you'll get too dark, and then you won't find a good husband. And that's growing up in the United States, I heard all that stuff. But to the other degree, the contrast is I also had parents that were leaders in the community. You know, they started the first Bengali association in Atlanta. They started the first Indian restaurant in Atlanta. My mom was president of the Bengali Association. So leadership was definitely something my parents were in. But my hesitance is when you're a leader, you're also there and fodder for the public to judge every mistake you make. And I think that's my hesitancy. I get we're all human beings that make mistakes all the time, right? But when you're in the limelight and you make a mistake, you're treated very differently. And especially in the work that we do around ending domestic and sexual violence, that can be really tough and hard. So that's part of my hesitance is like, I want to be an imperfect being. I want to be able to make my mistakes. I don't want to be seen and uplifted to such a light to where it's going to be easy to fall down if I make a mistake. So that's part of my hesitation. I also grew up in a family where there were 2 girls. And I remember telling my dad, oh, I know you really wanted a son. And luckily my dad was very much like, no, I enjoy having a daughter, you know, and he challenged me. And there were there's lots of gendered stuff. My mom being upset when I was 23 and I'm married, and us getting into big fights about that. But I've also had that fight to be able to go like, what if I am, I'm married and 40? If I'm happy, that's all that matters, you know? And luckily my father really stood up and supported me, like, get your education first. That's more important than getting married. Whereas my mom would be the one who'd be like, oh my God, what do I do with this daughter? She is a little bit too much for me to handle. But I think at the same time, she was also a vocal person, right? So I don't think she knew how to deal with a strong vocal daughter as well, because she wasn't used to growing up with that, even though she had a strong vocal voice. So that's, I mean, leadership is tough. It's a hard role, and it's hard to be, yeah, you have to own it, but that's still a struggle of like, okay, I get to be the boss. And it's isolating to be a leader at times and to try and be in that space. So I think those are some of the hesitations, because I do like being connected to community. I like being connected to my coworkers, all that stuff, but it is a struggle.
I'm thinking, what you share is your work at the locally situated Korean American church. And I also understand that you're serving now predominantly white church. So Eunbi is Eunbi. Do you perceive, do you experience, do you interact with different community people as a leader differently? Is it easier, for example, to be, have some kind of ownership with this leadership position in the white church than perhaps Korean American church? How do you experience leadership?
So I wanted to answer a 2-part. Your first question, owning my leadership. My parents wanted my education more than a husband, and so they were really afraid that I would get a husband and not finish my doctoral degree. So I felt like in terms of letting me become whoever I wanted to become was really important for my parents, and that was helpful for me in owning my leadership. And then the second part was that there were so many people who gave me a chance to be a leader. And I think without someone just giving you that opportunity to mess up and be less than perfect and still give you more opportunities, I think that was the best teacher for me to own my authority. So places like this at PANAAWTM, where there's so much mentoring and teaching, I just felt like that was really meaningful for me, for my formation. I'm so grateful. I'm getting emotional.
Thank you. Given the limited time, we're going to just reflect. These are some questions that I've been thinking about, but it's out there. So go back, and if you took mental notes, maybe questions that you have. This is time of our engagement and maybe sharing our journey toward justice together as a community. So feel free to lift up your thoughts, questions, any part of the stories that you need to hear more, want to hear more about their experiences. This is time for all of us.
I actually wanted to be that Ajuma and just answer the other question that you asked me. Would that be okay?
Which Ajuma?
So I wanted. I feel like I'm taking a lot of space. So that question, I thought it was important for me to answer because it was a learning experience for me going from a Korean American church to a wealthy, huge white church. I'm grossly overqualified for the position, but I felt very insecure. And I felt like I had to perform because these are CEOs of their own companies and lawyers, and they just want top notch. If you do really well, they don't say anything, but then if you mess up a little bit, it'll come back to you. So I think that made me feel very uptight and performance oriented. And I was not happy for a while. And then seeing my spiritual director, I realized, oh, why am I giving them so much power when I am qualified to be a leader at this place? I'm grossly overqualified. And also to think about my own identity, to really reflect on that. Where do I find my worth? From external affirmations, or do I find it from how I think of myself as, from my faith framework, as a child of God, and I am worthy, I have gifts that I love to share. And so I think that's really helped me going forth in these past weeks to not put up this front, hello, and be like, because I kind of saw myself preaching that a sermon the first time. I was very careful to pronounce all my words very clearly, and I was like, what am I doing? And when I listened to that sermon back, I was like, oh, I'm trying so hard. So after that, I've been trying to be very intentional about do the best that I can, but think about where my motivations are coming from and really figure out my worth as a person outside of external affirmation.
So they thought solidarity work works to keep whites in power? Is that what you said? Wow. Send me the link. I'd love to read that article. Me? I'm sorry, I'm just writing Jonathan Tran.
Me too. I was like,
I would really love to read. Well, let me just say when I started advancing justice, kind of like what Aparna said, when you're building something at your kitchen table, you have no choice but to coalition build. But the whole spirit of the organization was built on community organizing. So obviously organizing within Asian American communities, but to actually build credibility and power and ultimately fundraising, I had to go across racial and political lines. So did I find it at the grassroots level extremely helpful? Absolutely, absolutely. Are there interracial and inter-ethnic conflicts and divisions? Absolutely. And I think that's the next, in a way, plane of discussions around race. Because it's really easy for us to always talk, us versus, whites with a capital W. But how about between and among communities of color? And if you've done coalition work across racial and ethnic lines, you know what I'm talking about. And it's just way too complex and deep to answer fully. But from my vantage point, I think what's generally missing, and it's always a struggle, but particularly now in this political climate, is connectedness. We all want to connect, I think, as human beings, and we've got to find those core values that pull us together, even if we don't say things exactly the right way or whatever. I think it's essential, beyond race and ethnicity, that we as human beings try to find ways to connect. So I'm going to read this article, but I personally believe that's the whole reason why I do social justice work, because you want to lift up all of humanity, and give everyone in that community an equitable opportunity to live and thrive and succeed. So I would disagree, but I'm definitely going to find this article and read it. Sounds fascinating.
I second Helen on that. I still have friendships 20 years later with the individuals that we started working with, and each one of them has influenced me. We're still all good friends, and that's the one relationship I don't have to do a lot of work on. Now, when you're coalition building, are you making sure you're focused on the same values? Have you done the critical work to make sure you've set up some guidelines and some expectations and what's okay and what's not acceptable, and what do we not back down on? So I think there's groundwork that you have to do when you're doing coalition building. But I feel like, you know, in Georgia, when we started doing this work, it was the diversity issues were black and white. And when we came in as a coalition of many different organizations with the same values, it made a difference in us kind of being seen, being recognized, being on panels at all our state conferences, pushing for things that we needed, challenging funders when they were doing things that would hurt our communities, when they were trying to do some of the human trafficking laws. They wanted to go after the taxi cab drivers, and we're like, as a coalition, we're like, no. You're going after immigrant communities, go after the companies, don't go after the drivers who are sometimes the spouses of our clients, and we know there'll be a negative implication. So I think, you know, it's that unified voice of saying that we also have power, but making sure you have the values to make sure that you don't sell each other out, right?
Yeah, let me just say, I don't know if this is what this Jonathan Tran spoke about, but I do think sometimes what happens, which does not help us, is people of color. Let me just use funding as an example. Okay, there's a pie of money, philanthropic money, and 90% of it goes to white-led organizations. 10% go to people of color-led causes. And instead of people of color groups recognizing, wait a minute, we're being cheated out, what often happens is we get siloed in our own little bubble and fight for these scraps instead of purposefully doing the messy, hard work of building a true coalition and identifying this broader, you know, inequity. So I don't know if that's what he talked about. I think that can happen. I think another thing that can happen, I read this great book, Decolonizing Wealth. Read it, please. And this philanthropist, Native American guy, was talking about a lot of people of color in philanthropy seeing like nonprofit people as the field slaves, and the people of color within philanthropy as the house slaves, you know? So I think that too is a divide and conquer tactic that often happens intentionally, unintentionally, within and among communities of color, and we need to, that's more that inner work where you're like, wait a minute, let me check myself. You know, maybe I need to reach out and do a little bit more talking, connecting.
Right. I remember when we'd write for grants, we'd all be applying to the Atlanta Women's Foundation. We would all put a letter of support for each other saying, yes, I'm asking for money, but we can't do this work without each other, and that we need each other as partners. And that was part of our values and how we were doing the work. And I know other groups that said, you know, Asian Women's Shelter in California, when they were fighting with the white shelters to get funding, part of what they said is, why don't we ask for a bigger piece of the pie? And why don't we get them to get more money? So part of it is, instead of getting into competition, thinking about what's right for all of our communities, and that the fight doesn't become just about our communities, but all of our communities, and how do we support other marginalized groups and other groups that are not seen and valued, and that needs to be a core principle of your coalition building work.
I feel like we have just begun, you know, tackling a particular issue at a time and struggle at a time. I'm very conscious about the time. And so I saw Unju's hand, so I will make Unju's sharing as the last remark for this panel. And I'm going to encourage, if I could just say this, can you linger with us a little bit more? So when we, after the panel, maybe we could have coffee together. We have 10 minutes of break as we set up the worship service and business meeting. So I would like for us to kind of linger a little bit so that our discussion can continue. Yes, Unju.
I'm extremely grateful for this particular session, because I'm going to be very honest here. There seems to be an assumption in PANAAWTM that we don't have to talk about faith we're all for justice. I see the intersection of faith and justice. I've observed it today, and I'm very grateful, and I feel hopeful. I say that because especially in, Eunbi's presentation, she showed me that this very marginalized space in a church, which is not a favorite site of doing justice for many of us who are in the public square, can be a site of resistance and site of empowerment and education for justice. And we ask the question, what resources and support do we need? One resource we can claim is church. And I hope we can start doing that. And in your case, about voter registration and voting, Korean churches, I am just blown away that as many as 12 Korean churches opened up their doors. That's like church in the streets, just like in the civil rights era, okay? So walls are breaking down. I never imagined that would happen, so thank you so much. So I think we need to claim these resources that we have. Don't just look to the lenders, funders, but look within, because in these days, even in secular world, they talk about the internal transformation and outer transformation, all as a Mobius strip. So I think as people of faith, whatever you claim to be your faith tradition or religion or spirituality, whatever it may be, I think we need to start claiming these resources. And that's, as a very older member of PANAAWTM, I want to leave this community with. Thank you.
So I am going to add one more thing. I want to remind you all to make space and time to talk about healthy relationships. Talking about domestic violence, as faith leaders, you play a critical role in providing support. So don't be afraid to have these conversations and partner with some of the organizations that are doing this work in your community, because folks are more likely to go to their faith leaders before they come to us. And being armed with that information, you can provide support and influence in very powerful ways.
Thank you. On behalf of PANAAWTM, I really am grateful for the fact that you make the time and care and solidarity with us to share your experiences. Thank you. We're gonna we have totally fresh pot of coffee right outside and some sweets right outside. So let's continue discussing and maybe sharing a little bit as we organize this 10 minutes.
Thank you. It was great to hear from you. Great. All the work that you're doing.
이거 어떻게 빼? 이거 어떻게 빼? 잘못한 거야. 이거 다 빼. I see. I see.